Hey folks, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Tonight's story? It's about what happened after you got stabbed on a medieval battlefield. Spoiler, surviving the fight didn't mean you survived the day. This video dives deep into the mud, the screams, and the make-it-up-as-you-go nightmare that was medieval battlefield medicine. No anesthetics, no clean tools, just saw, blood, and prayers that usually went unanswered. Now, think about this. Today, if you get hurt, you're whisked away in an ambulance. Trained professionals treat you with sterile equipment, and anesthesia knocks you out before the scalpel even touches skin. But back then, a battlefield wound was the start of your suffering, not the end. No painkillers, no hygiene. Just hope you pass out before the knife gets to bone. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. All right, you've been warned. Let's get into it. This is why medieval battlefield medicine was a nightmare. You open your eyes to a sky smeared with smoke and screams. The stench of iron fills your nostrils, blood mostly, but mixed with manure, sweat, and something far worse that you can't quite place. You're lying in a field, your ears still ringing from the clash of swords and the thunder of hooves. You don't remember how you went down, but you feel it now, a deep slice across your thigh, raw and burning. Not a mortal wound, you think. You might even survive, which, unfortunately, is the problem. See, in the Middle Ages, surviving a battle didn't mean you'd live to tell the tale. It meant the real nightmare was just beginning. Because now that you're no longer swinging a sword or hiding behind a wooden shield, you've been promoted to patient. A role filled with screaming, fever, gangrene, and very little actual healing. The battlefield is no place for mercy. It's a mud-soaked hell where the lucky die quickly, and the unlucky are dragged to the back lines for a special brand of suffering that makes combat look like recess. Wounded soldiers were often dumped in makeshift medical zones that weren't so much hospitals as they were meat lockers for the barely breathing. Imagine a tent stitched together with stained linen and hope, where the floor is mud, the tools are rusted, and the only anesthesia is biting down on whatever someone shoves into your mouth. If you're lucky, it's a leather strap. If not, it's your own hand. Around you, men moan, shriek, convulse. The only constants are the buzzing of flies, the dripping of blood, and the sharp metallic ring of blades being cleaned with spit or a bit of ale. No sterilization, no antibiotics, no knowledge of germs. Just a strong stomach, and the belief that if you're still screaming, you're still alive. You might hope a surgeon is coming, but let's define surgeon properly. In medieval terms, this could be anyone with a blade and confidence. Barbers doubled as surgeons. Monks did it in between prayers. Blacksmiths were drafted in a pinch because, hey, they're good with tools, right? The one thing they all had in common was a basic approach. Cut it off, burn it shut, and pray the infection takes its time. Battlefield triage wasn't about who could be saved. It was about who might not scream the loudest. If you were too injured, they let you die. If your wound was clean enough, and your soul hadn't left your body yet, they'd haul you under a filthy tarp, grab the nearest blade, and start digging. There was no waiting room, no consent forms. Just a grim nod, a gulp of ale, and then the sound of metal meeting flesh. And through it all, you were awake, fully awake, watching, hearing, feeling. Bones were cracked open like stale bread. Flesh was sawed through with the kind of blades that would make modern surgeons weep. You didn't go numb, you went mad. People screamed so loudly their voices gave out. Some died just from the shock. Others tried to crawl away mid-operation. There was no mercy, no sedation, and absolutely no quiet. So, welcome to the battlefield, but not the heroic, banner-waving version. This isn't a tapestry. This is real. And if you thought war was hell, just wait until you meet medieval medicine. Because out here, blood isn't spilled. It's harvested. So, you've been wounded. You've bled. You've cried. You may have even screamed your ancestors' names into the sky. But against all odds, you've been treated. And by treated, we mean someone hacked the limb, smeared something vaguely herbal on the stump, and told you not to die before nightfall. The bleeding has stopped, probably from a combination of panic, shock, and divine sarcasm. You're alive, technically. But now comes the part no one ever puts in the songs, the waiting game, the long, feverish journey of post-battle recovery, where every breath could be your last. In the medieval world, an injury wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence that came with a very long, very painful trial. A deep cut, if untreated, and let's be honest, everything was untreated, could fester within hours. And don't think your body gets a chance to fight back. Your immune system is weaker than a drunken squire because it's too busy dealing with lice, fleas, and malnutrition to worry about that nasty little spear hole in your ribs. Infection was so common that pus wasn't a red flag. It was a welcome mat. Medieval doctors actually believed that pus was a sign your body was healing. If your wound started oozing white or yellow slime, they called it laudable pus. Laudable, as in praiseworthy. Never mind that it usually meant sepsis was setting in and your body was going full meltdown. If the wound turned black, congratulations. You had gangrene. It meant your flesh was dying while still attached to you. The smell alone could clear a room, and it often did, because people feared it was contagious. And in a way, it was. The stench of death that spread from one tent to the next. Forget antibiotics. They didn't exist. Antiseptics? Nope. Your best chance at survival was if the wound was shallow, if you were lucky enough not to be touched by the surgeon's already filthy hands, and if your body had enough strength left to fend off the invisible army of bacteria crawling through every inch of your flesh. Spoiler, most didn't. Even worse, many wounds weren't clean cuts. Swords left jagged tears. Arrows splintered into the body. Maces crushed bone and left internal bleeding that no one could see or understand. You might have a fractured rib poking into your lung, or a punctured organ leaking slow death into your belly, and no one would know until you stopped breathing 3 days later. And just when you thought you'd made it through the worst, the fever would start. You'd wake in the night, soaked in sweat, teeth chattering, mumbling nonsense. Your heart would pound like a war drum. The villagers would whisper ghosts or demons. The priest would bring holy water. But the truth? Blood poisoning. Your body turning against itself, rotting from the inside out. The burning, the shaking, the slipping in and out of consciousness. That was your final battle, and most lost. So yes, you survived the blade. But now you live with the blade's curse. A wound wasn't the end. It was a long, agonizing path toward either recovery or the grave. And even those who healed carried scars deeper than skin. Misshapen limbs, chronic pain, and phantom aches haunted them like the spirits of comrades left behind in the mud. And society didn't treat the wounded like heroes. You weren't a veteran. You were a cripple, a burden. Another broken body limping through an unforgiving world. Out here, death came slow, and survival, that was just the beginning of your suffering. You might think armor is your salvation, a clinking, shining promise that the blade won't touch you, that once you're strapped into your steel cocoon, you've bought yourself safety, maybe even immortality. Wrong. Medieval armor was impressive, sure. It could deflect arrows, blunt sword strikes, and make you look terrifying from a distance. But in terms of medical outcomes, it often just bought you a slightly different kind of death. Let's start with mobility. Armor is heavy, sometimes up to 60 pounds. Not too bad when you're standing tall and striking poses, but try hauling yourself across a muddy field with a bleeding leg and one arm dangling like boiled meat. It turns into a personal torture device. You can't move fast, you can't run, and if you fall, you're done. Like a flipped turtle, flailing and shouting while arrows find your armpits, thighs, or the ever-vulnerable groin. Because here's the ugly truth. Armor had gaps. It had to. Humans bend, and the joints, underarms, neck, and back of the knees were prime targets. Skilled fighters knew exactly where to aim. A dagger slipped beneath the breastplate. A mace crushing the helm until your skull turned to paste. And if you did get hit, the armor didn't just fail to protect you, it helped the damage. Blunt force trauma through plate was no joke. A hammer blow might not pierce the metal, but it could still break your ribs, rupture organs, or snap your spine like a dry twig. And then there's the heat. In full armor, under a summer sun, you don't just sweat, you boil. Heat stroke was common, dehydration constant, and sometimes soldiers collapsed mid-battle without a wound on them. No one had invented ventilation or cooling tech. Your advanced war gear turned into a coffin that baked you alive. Now, let's say you take a wound through the armor. Maybe an arrow sneaks past your gorget and lodges in your collar. Getting it out means removing the armor. Except you're already screaming, the blood's gushing, and the straps are jammed with grime. You'll need 2 squires, a knife, and a small miracle just to peel you out. Meanwhile, your body's going into shock, and the clock is ticking. Wounds acquired inside armor were particularly nasty. Sweat, heat, and lack of ventilation turned small punctures into incubators for infection. Leather linings soaked up blood and trapped it. Bacteria thrived. You were walking around in a disease incubator, and when the armor came off, if it came off, it often took skin with it. But here's the final twist of the dagger. Your armor made you a target. A shiny, expensive one. You weren't just a soldier. You were a prize. Enemies wanted to kill you for your gear. Or worse, they didn't want to kill you. They wanted to wound you, drag you off, and ransom you, which meant prolonging your agony for money. Congratulations. You've officially become merchandise. So, no, armor didn't save you. It delayed your death, maybe, turned it into something more cinematic. But once the battle ended, and you were lying on the ground, gasping for air, bleeding into your boots, the armor didn't matter. Because the tools waiting for you back at the surgeon's tent couldn't tell the difference between knight and footman. And neither could the infection that was already in your bloodstream, planning its next move. Let's talk injuries. Not the mild kind that earns you sympathy and a bandage. The medieval battlefield variety. The kind that turns bones into gravel, intestines into abstract art, and makes you beg the heavens to take you now, please. Because, unlike today's neat bullet wounds or clean scalpel slices, medieval weapons made a mess. They weren't designed for precision. They were designed for chaos. Start with arrows. Sounds simple, right? Thin shaft, sharp tip. Except these weren't modern archery tools. war arrows had bodkin points that pierced armor or broadheads that sliced open flesh like hot knives through butter. One in your gut didn't just poke a hole. It tore a path, ripping organs, veins, and anything else in its way. And pulling it out? Oh, that's cute. Arrows often had barbed heads, meaning removal meant more ripping, unless you had a surgeon willing to cut deeper, which you didn't. So the arrow stayed in, or you screamed until it came out sideways. Next up, axes. The medieval axe didn't mess around. A single swing could remove limbs, crush skulls, or embed itself so deep it took a second person to pull it free. Axes didn't just wound, they destroyed. Even a glancing blow could break bones or leave gaping wounds that exposed muscle and sinew like a butchered animal. There's no stitching that back together. At best, you got wrapped up in a bloody rag and told to stop moving. At worst, someone reached for the cauterizing iron. Then we have maces and flails, blunt weapons, seemingly less flashy, but arguably worse. A mace won't cut you. It'll break you. Crush your hand through a gauntlet, collapse your jaw through a helm, shatter ribs, compress lungs, and give you a concussion so bad you forget your own name. The worst part, with no external wound, medics had no idea what was happening inside. You might look fine and still die by morning, coughing blood and forgetting how to breathe. And don't forget swords. Yes, they were sharp. Yes, they were iconic. But they weren't surgical. Swords hacked. They weren't designed to neatly slice. They bludgeoned through flesh, bouncing off bone, splintering limbs. Some had jagged edges meant to tear rather than cut. A deep sword wound wasn't just painful, it was disfiguring. And the bleeding didn't stop unless the blade got lucky and missed a major artery. Spoiler, it rarely did. Every injury came with bonus features. Splinters from shields lodged in wounds, dirt and manure from the battlefield, dragged in with every slice, and broken weapons stuck in flesh because the blade snapped mid-fight. No clean cuts, just noise, carnage, and aftermaths that looked like a horror show no one wanted to produce. And the worst thing about all this? There were no specialists, no trauma teams, no advanced care. If someone came running to help you after your gut spilled onto the grass, they were just guessing. And the guess was always the same. Cut it off, burn it, or let God decide. Out here, pain wasn't a consequence. It was the default setting. Blood. So much blood. It's pouring out of your leg like it's late for something. Thick, dark, sticky. It soaks your clothes, your armor, the dirt beneath you. You can feel your heartbeat in the wound. Every throb pushing more life out of your body. You press down, scream, curse the heavens. But it doesn't stop. Because in the Middle Ages, once you started bleeding, there were no tourniquets, no trauma pads, no quick clamp field kits. There was just you, your panic, and whatever someone nearby could find, usually a handful of dirty linen and blind hope. Stopping bleeding was more prayer than practice. The basic approach? Pack the wound with anything absorbent. Moss, wool, old rags. Not sterile ones, mind you. Those don't exist. We're talking about tunic scraps that haven't seen clean water since the last crusade. Once stuffed, the wound might be wrapped, usually with leather ties, rope, or more cloth. None of it tight enough to truly compress an artery, but hey, maybe the blood will run out eventually. And if it's a serious arterial bleed, you're done. No one knew how to clamp or ligate a vessel. There were no hemostats, no stitches designed to hold under pressure. A deep slash to the thigh could drain you in minutes. Blood loss wasn't understood beyond "he's looking pale" or "he stopped yelling." They didn't know what a liter was. They didn't track blood types. You lost enough blood, you died. That was the rule. But, Let's say, by some twisted miracle, you don't die immediately. You're dragged to the back of the battlefield. Your wound still leaks, slow and steady. The solution? Fire. Not metaphorical fire. Real, screaming, blackened flesh fire. They bring a poker from the fire pit, red hot and smoking, and press it straight onto the wound. Cauterization. The medieval answer to every problem. Your flesh sizzles. The smell hits your nose like a brick wall. And the pain? It's indescribable. You howl like a wounded animal thrashing against the hands holding you down. You're not asleep for this. You're never asleep for this. Sometimes the cautery works. More often, it seals the wound and the bacteria inside. Infections get locked in with the blood, festering beneath the scorched skin. Days later, the wound swells, turns purple, bursts open again like an angry mouth. You're back where you started, only now your body's too weak to scream. Bleeding wasn't just a symptom. It was a timer, a countdown. If it couldn't be stopped within minutes, you were gone. If it was stopped badly, you'd die slower and smellier. Medieval medicine feared bleeding, not because they understood circulation, but because they saw what happened next. The shaking, the gasping, the stillness. They didn't call it shock, but they knew the look, the wide eyes, the cold skin, the silence. And those who survived? They were never the same. Pale, exhausted, sometimes blind or delirious for days. And that was considered a lucky outcome. Because if the bleeding didn't kill you, the treatment probably tried its best. So the blade came down, or the arrow struck, or the mace caved in your shoulder. Either way, you're down. You're not dead, but you've been hit, and now you're lying on your back staring at a sky that doesn't care. Blood trickles, bones grind, nerves scream. You want help. But what happens next isn't heroism, it's logistics. You're now a problem to be moved, not a person to be saved. First comes the drag. No stretchers, no neck braces, no gentle loading. Just two fellow soldiers yanking you across the battlefield by your arms, legs, or whatever isn't actively spurting. Your body bangs over roots, rocks, corpses. If your ribs weren't broken before, they are now. If your spine was twisted, now it's worse. And they're not gentle. Why would they be? Your meat, loud meat, may be still useful, but mostly inconvenient. You're dumped behind the lines, if you're lucky. Maybe under a tent. Maybe just beside a wagon. You're surrounded by others, moaning, dying, twitching. Some have already stopped moving. Some are begging for water. No one's getting any. There are too few hands, too few supplies, too little time. A medic appears, or a barber, or a monk. They look at your wound, frown, and make a decision. Treat, delay, or leave. You better hope you land in the treat pile. Then begins the care, which is to say, improvisation. They might try to clean the wound with ale or vinegar, if there's any left that hasn't been drunk. They might cut open the skin wider to let the bad out. They'll prod with dirty tools, maybe sew it shut with picket thread. No gloves, no masks, just hands, spit, and superstition. Pain is a given. You're expected to handle it. Crying is fine. Screaming is common. Passing out is preferred. It makes you easier to work on. No one's checking your pulse. No one's monitoring your vitals. They just keep going until you stop reacting. There's no follow-up care, no chart, no progress check. Once the wound is patched, you're laid aside to wait. For healing, for infection, for death, all equally likely. You might recover, or the wound might reopen, or the fever might come. And if it does, they might try another remedy. cutting you again to balance your humors, or sticking leeches on your skin to drain the sickness. You're not a patient. You're an experiment with a heartbeat. And if you're conscious through all this, you'll watch others die. Some cry for mothers. Some beg for water. Some go quiet mid-sentence. You'll see the rats arrive. You'll smell the rot. And you'll know exactly what's coming for you. Because in the medieval battlefield, getting hit wasn't the worst part. What came after? The dragging, the slicing, the guessing game of survival. That was the real horror show. The man approaching you doesn't look like a healer. He's not wearing white. There's no symbol of medicine, no aura of calm professionalism. He's wearing a leather apron, crusted with stains that are equal parts blood, sweat, and old soup. His tools hang from a belt that clinks as he walks. Knives, hooks, saws. They're not shiny. They're not clean. They're not precise. This isn't a surgeon. This is a butcher. And you, lucky you, are today's slab of meat. Medieval battlefield medics weren't trained in the way we think of doctors today. There were no degrees, no licensing boards, no anatomy classes. The closest thing to a credential was experience. And by experience, we mean the number of men they'd sliced open who hadn't immediately died. Barbers doubled as surgeons because they were already skilled with sharp objects and used to handling screams. Monks performed surgery because they could read. Blacksmiths got involved when something needed cutting fast. The common denominator? None of them had a clue about germs. Your medic might pray before cutting, or he might not. He doesn't ask for your permission. He doesn't explain what he's about to do. He just reaches for the blade and gets to work. You are an object, a problem to be solved with steel and speed. His goal isn't healing. His goal is triage. Get the dying out of the way, patch up the maybe salvageable, and try not to slip on the blood pooling beneath his feet. He slices your tunic away with a blade that was last used on another screaming man 10 minutes ago. There's no wash basin, no antiseptic. He wipes the knife on his apron, shrugs, and begins cutting into your wound. You jerk, you howl. You're not given anything for the pain. Maybe someone lets you grip a stick. Maybe someone sits on your chest to keep you from kicking. That's the best you'll get. There's no sense of sterile technique, no clean field. The tools are handled with bare hands. The wound is inspected by sight and smell. If it doesn't look too black or too wormy, that's considered promising. If it smells more like rot than blood, that's bad. The medic might scoop out pus with a spoon. He might jam moss into the hole. He might try a bit of honey, if someone told him that once helped a monk in Wales. The work is quick, brutal, and chaotic. There's no time for compassion. The line of the dying is too long. And if you die mid-operation, you get rolled off to the side, replaced by another unlucky soul. The same tools are used, barely wiped off. No one pauses. No one cries. The medic moves to the next task like a man trimming fat from a carcass. And when the day is done, when the battlefield quiets, when the last scream has died in the wind, he wipes down his tools, drains a cup of ale, and waits for the next round of misery. Because out here, the medic isn't a healer, he's an executioner with better PR. There's no schedule, no plan, no prep. Surgery on a medieval battlefield was like trying to fix a collapsing house during an earthquake, with a shovel and a guess. The patient is screaming, the medic is sweating, and the only guarantee is that someone's going to bleed. A lot. The operating theater is a patch of dirt behind a wagon or inside a tent that smells like urine and despair. No clean sheets, no table. If you're lucky, you lie on a wooden bench. If not, the ground. Your anesthesia is a mug of ale and a prayer that the pain will knock you out. It rarely does. The surgery begins the moment someone shouts, "Hold him down." That's your cue. Arms pinned, legs locked. The surgeon leans in and starts cutting, not gently, not with precision, but fast and deep, sawing through muscle, tearing into flesh like he's field dressing a boar. There are no fine instruments here. No scalpels, no retractors, just knives, bone saws, maybe an awl, maybe a hot poker. If your leg is crushed or pierced through, there's one solution: cut it off. And so he does. The saw screeches against bone. The patient thrashes until the blood loss starts to do its work. By the time the limb is off, the flesh is flayed open like a raw roast. The wound isn't cleaned, it's burned shut. The cautery iron is shoved deep into the stump, sealing vessels, charring muscle. The smell rises instantly, burning fat and sizzling blood. The scream is inhuman. It's the sound of the soul trying to flee the body. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the patient dies mid-cauterization, from shock, pain, or a stopped heart. And if the wound gets infected afterward, there's nothing left to do. No antibiotics, no second surgery, no skin grafts. Just rot, fever, and waiting. Some surgeons experimented with ointments made of wine, herbs, or, if they were truly desperate, animal dung. Yes, dung. Because medieval medicine walked the line between guesswork and outright madness. Limbs weren't the only thing they operated on. Sometimes they'd try to lance abscesses, drain wounds, even perform crude trepanations, drilling into skulls to relieve pressure caused by swelling, spirits, or a nasty fall. These didn't often end well. It's hard to recover from brain surgery when you're surrounded by filth and fed gruel. Surgery wasn't rare, but success was. Most patients died, and those who lived carried more than scars. They carried trauma, nightmares, chronic pain, and the knowledge that their survival had been a bloody coin toss. There were no miracle recoveries, no triumphant limps into the sunset. Only groaning survivors dragged behind carts, stitched together with luck, scar tissue, and the stubborn refusal to die. Modern surgery comes with a miracle: unconsciousness, a numbed body, a blank memory of the pain. In today's world, you get knocked out and wake up stitched up. Not so in the Middle Ages. Back then, there was no drifting off into painless darkness. Just an escalating panic as the saw came closer and the prayers got louder. Because if you were going under the knife, you were staying awake, every second of it. Anesthesia didn't exist. Not really. There were concoctions, of course, herbal brews made from poppy, mandrake, henbane, or belladonna, but they were unreliable and dangerous. The doses were imprecise. Too little, and they dulled nothing. Too much, and they shut your lungs down. Most battlefield medics didn't have access to these herbs, and those who did rarely knew how to use them. The choice was simple: feel everything or die trying not to. So instead of anesthesia, you got distraction. "Bite this," they'd say, and hand you a stick, a leather belt, a piece of wood. Anything to muffle your screaming and keep your jaw from breaking. You were held down, arms and legs pinned by others, not gently, not carefully, forcefully. Because the second the knife touched skin, your body would try to escape itself. You might be offered ale or mead beforehand, not for the wound, but for courage. Alcohol numbed the senses a little, if you hadn't already passed out from blood loss. But the truth was this: most battlefield surgeries were performed on fully alert, fully aware, fully terrified human beings. You watched the blade. You felt it enter you. You heard your own tendons snap and flesh tear. You smelled your body open, And that's where the prayer came in. Because when the surgeon was sawing through your leg and you were still alive to feel it, you needed something to cling to. God, saints, a miracle, anything. Medics muttered prayers. Patients screamed them. Some passed out midway through. Others chanted until their voice gave out. But no matter what faith you held, pain didn't care. It carved its name in your bones and dared you to survive it. Recovery didn't come with morphine. There were no pills, no drips. Pain remained, constant, gnawing, unrelenting. Nights were spent writhing in sweat-drenched straw, hallucinating from the agony, teeth clenched, eyes wide. There was no peace, only the slow, cruel descent from stabbing torment to burning ache to permanent throb. Prayer was your only sedative, and sometimes even God looked away. The saw isn't polished. It isn't sterile. It isn't even really a medical tool. It's a carpenter's blade. And right now, it's about to decide your fate. The medic grips it with both hands. You, on the other hand, grip nothing, because both of yours are being pinned down by two burly men. Your leg is shattered beyond repair, crushed and pierced by a war hammer. The solution? Remove it. All of it. Above the knee. You're not going to like what comes next. There's no countdown, no warning. The medic starts sawing, and the sound, that awful, rasping, wet saw sound, is enough to make strong men weep. It begins with a scream. Your scream, loud, wordless, primal. It doesn't stop. The blade chews through skin and muscle first, dragging through resistance like a blade through old meat. Blood sprays, not in a neat stream but in spurts that stain the sawyer, the walls, the ground. Your head thrashes, your body bucks, but you're pinned tight. You're not going anywhere except deeper into pain. When the bone is reached, the scream changes, becomes a howl. The saw teeth catch on hard calcium, grinding, skipping, screeching. It's not fast. It's not clean. Sometimes the saw gets stuck. Sometimes the medic has to backtrack, start again, reposition. Every movement sends new waves of agony through your body, white-hot and sharp, until you're no longer screaming, you're sobbing, or worse, silent. Around you, others are waiting, watching. Some will be next. Others already went through it. They lie still, pale, eyes vacant. Maybe unconscious, maybe just broken. Because the saw isn't just a tool. It's trauma incarnate. A device of last resort, brought out only when flesh has failed. And in the hands of a frantic field medic it becomes a judgment. Survive with half a body or die whole. Once the limb is off, the stump has to be sealed, which means fire. A red-hot iron pressed into the open end like a branding mark. You feel the burn. The nerves cry out again. There's no numbness, no mercy. The smell is unforgettable. Charred flesh, hair, blood, panic. You may never sleep peacefully again. Survival isn't even guaranteed. You've endured the saw, the fire, the screaming. But infection waits patiently. Shock lurks nearby. Your body might still give up. But if you do live, you carry the memory forever. Not just in your scars, but in your sleep, in your breath, in the way you flinch when someone touches your leg, only to remember it's not there anymore. In the Middle Ages, the saw didn't heal, it punished. You've been told to stay strong. You've been told the worst is yet to come. And now you're being told, very seriously, to bite down on a stick. Not because you're hungry, not because it has magic properties, But because what's about to happen to you is going to hurt so much, your teeth might shatter if left to their own devices. So here it is, a splintered piece of wood, already grooved from the last poor soul who used it. You clamp down, and the pain begins. The medieval battlefield didn't have morphine. It had faith, fear, and wood. The stick was your anesthesia, your painkiller, your psychological anchor as someone sliced, sawed, or burned their way through your flesh. It kept your screams muffled. It gave your jaw something to fight. And most importantly, it gave your mind something to focus on. Something other than the red-hot agony lighting your nerves on fire. Sticks weren't the only option, of course. Some men were given leather straps. Some bit into rolled-up cloth. If none of that was available, you were told to bite your own hand or a friend's sleeve. Anything to keep your mouth occupied while your body was reduced to its basic primal instinct. Survive. But here's the thing. Biting the stick didn't help the pain. It just gave it structure. As the saw cut through your bone, you weren't relieved. You were distracted. Barely. The wood creaked under your jaw, sometimes cracked, occasionally splintered and lodged in your mouth. You might spit blood that wasn't even from your wound. Your jaw ached for days, assuming you didn't dislocate it from sheer tension. And sometimes, just to pile insult onto injury, the stick snapped mid-operation. Gone. Now it's you, screaming unfiltered, your cries echoing through the surgeon's tent like a death rattle. There's no backup. The medic doesn't pause. He's still sawing. You just have to live with it. Wide-eyed, wide-mouthed, and utterly exposed to every raw second of torment. Even after surgery, the stick lingered. Soldiers kept one in their packs if they could. It became a talisman, a physical reminder of what they'd survived. Some carved names into them. Some wore them like amulets. Others burned them afterward, as if trying to exorcise the pain. But every soldier, every peasant, every poor wounded bastard knew the phrase, "Bite this stick." It was the grim beginning to something much worse. A wooden prayer against a flood of pain. A helpless gesture in a world where suffering was expected, and mercy rarely seen. The surgery is done, the limb is gone, the wound is sealed, or at least stopped bleeding for now. You've been bandaged, maybe blessed, and laid gently in a corner of the surgeon's tent. Relief floods in. You've survived. You're going to make it. But what you don't know is that your biggest enemy hasn't arrived yet. It's infection, and it doesn't knock. It oozes in, quiet and unstoppable, with a grin full of rot. In the Middle Ages, infection wasn't understood. Germs weren't part of medical theory. No one talked about bacteria or microbes or invisible killers swarming wounds with every breath of foul air. What they did believe was this: if a wound smelled bad, it was full of bad humors. If pus appeared, it was laudable. If your fever rose, it meant God was testing you or punishing you. Treatment. Pray harder. Wounds were rarely cleaned, and when they were, it was with wine, vinegar, or dirty water. Tools weren't sterilized. Bandages were reused. Cloth was unwashed. Surgeons wiped knives on their tunics, their aprons, or, if feeling fancy, on the edge of the patient's own cloak. The result? Infections were less a risk and more a guarantee. In the days following a surgery or serious wound, your body became a battlefield of its own. The area around the injury swelled, pulsed, and turned color. Purple, green, black. The smell grew worse. Discharge thickened, and the pain shifted from sharp to sickening. Fever followed. Chills, sweats. Your thoughts turned cloudy. You stopped eating, talking, blinking. Infection wasn't loud at first, but it built. Day after day it tightened its grip. And the worst part, it wasn't dramatic. You didn't scream your way into death. You faded, slowly. The others around you didn't even notice at first. Then they did. The smell, the moaning, the rattling breath. That's when they knew you wouldn't see the next sunrise. Treatment was laughable. Leeches were applied. Pus was lanced with dull blades. Sometimes garlic paste was rubbed into the wound, sometimes hot oil. One remedy involved stuffing the wound with moss and sealing it shut with wax. It worked only in the way that mummification works. You still died, just preserved a little longer. Some soldiers carried their infections for weeks, months, festering ulcers, maggots in wounds, open sores that never healed. They didn't die right away. They just suffered in slow motion until their bodies gave out, or their minds did. And here's the legacy. Infection became tradition. So common, so expected. It wasn't even considered a complication anymore. It was just the next chapter. You got cut, you got infected. That was the way. No one questioned it, because questioning it wouldn't save you. It would just make the death feel more personal. You wake up to a sticky warmth under your bandage. It's not blood. It's thicker, murkier, yellow, maybe green. Smells like rot wrapped in regret. You think something's gone horribly wrong. But then the surgeon leans in, peels back the cloth, and grins. "Laudable pus," he says. Laudable, as in worthy of praise. Congratulations, you're not infected. You're healing, allegedly. In medieval medicine, pus wasn't a warning sign. It was a celebration. Doctors and barber surgeons believed that if your wound oozed thick, colored goo, it meant your body was purging the poison. They didn't understand bacteria. They didn't know about sterile fields or immune responses. What they saw was this. Wounds that didn't ooze often turned black and killed people. Wounds that oozed took longer to kill. So pus became a good omen, a sticky, stinking badge of honor. They called it good pus, a sign of a healthy inflammation. Never mind that it often meant gangrene, abscesses, or the early signs of systemic infection. Never mind that many of the patients lauded for their healing soon followed the same slow, feverish descent into oblivion. The logic was based on superstition wrapped in observation, and in an era without microscopes or germ theory, that was as close to science as it got. So while you're lying there, leaking, hallucinating from fever and stench, your caretakers are patting themselves on the back. They're nodding, proud. The wound is ripening. That was the term. Like a piece of fruit, a festering, half-rotten plum hanging from a dying tree. Once it had ripened, they might lance it, stab it open again, and let more pus pour out. This wasn't done with a clean tool. Oh, no. Often it was with the same knife they used to shave someone earlier that day, or a rusty nail, or a spoon. After draining, they'd rewrap the wound with fresh bandages. And by fresh, we mean someone found a cloth that hadn't been used in at least 24 hours. The cycle continued. Drain, praise, rewrap, wait. It was less medical treatment, more medieval composting. And those who didn't ooze? They were the ones to fear. A clean wound with no pus? That was dry rot. It meant the flesh was dead inside. The patient, too, most likely. So yes, pus was the preferred option. It didn't matter that it smelled like doom. It didn't matter that it soaked through your clothes. If you were leaking, you were living, at least for now. You're shaking, pale, cold, blood still oozing from your wound. You need help, real help. But instead of a remedy, they bring a jar. Inside, black, writhing things, leeches, wriggling like they know your misery. And in the medieval mind, they do. Because what you need, clearly, is less blood. That's right, less. The solution to your bleeding, your fever, your trauma, drain more. Leeches were the high priests of medieval medicine. If pus was praised, leeches were exalted. They were living tools used to balance the humors. Too much blood was often blamed for everything from headaches to infected wounds. So out came the leeches, sticky, slimy, with tiny teeth that latched on and drank deep. They weren't clean. They weren't chosen for safety. Leeches were often gathered from swamps, rivers, or water barrels. No one thought to sanitize them. Why would they? They were doing God's work, sucking out the excess, purging the illness. The more blood you lost, the better. Fainting was seen as progress. Dizziness was divine. And the wounds the leeches left? Well, they'd stop bleeding eventually. Hopefully. Maybe. They were placed near wounds, on temples, necks, thighs, chests, wherever the healer believed your humors were too rich. The leech bit down, and you waited, sometimes for hours. They gorged themselves, swelled grotesquely, then dropped off, sated and full of your lifeblood. A good session might involve a dozen of them, on you, at once. But here's the letdown. Most patients didn't get better. They got worse, weaker, more prone to infection. Their wounds bled longer. Some bled out. But the leech itself wasn't blamed. If anything, you just hadn't bled enough. The solution? More leeches. In some cases, people reused the same leeches from patient to patient. That meant cross-contamination was practically guaranteed. If the man before you had sepsis, congratulations, you now have it too. The leech, fat with disease, passed it on lovingly with every bite. Leeching wasn't just battlefield medicine. It was practiced across every level of society, from peasants to kings. It was so widespread, so entrenched, that criticizing it was almost heresy. Leeches were marketed, traded, even stolen. Wars were fought while leeches were packed lovingly alongside rations. But they didn't save lives. They drained them, slowly, quietly, one bite at a time. You've survived the saw, somehow. Maybe your leg is gone, maybe your arm, maybe just a chunk of flesh. The bleeding's slowed, but it hasn't stopped. You're dizzy, cold, trembling, and then someone mutters the words every medieval patient dreaded, "Bring the iron." A moment later, you hear it, metal pulled from flame, a sizzle, not from flesh, not yet, just from the poker, glowing red, smoking in the air like it's hungry. It is. Cauterization was the medieval cure-all. Bleeding? Burn it. Wound won't close? Burn it. Suspected infection? Guess what? Burn that too. The method was simple. Sear the injury shut with red-hot metal. The theory? Fire would stop the bleeding and purify the area. Reality? Pain, suffering, and scars so deep they haunted you in your dreams. You're not unconscious. There's no anesthetic. You're wide awake. Someone holds you down, hard. Another steadies the limb. And the surgeon, barely flinching, presses the iron into your open wound. It doesn't happen slowly. It's not a gentle brand. It's a violent hiss, a flash of steam, and a wave of pain that tears your mind from your body. The smell is the first thing that hits everyone around you. Burning hair, burning skin, burning blood. A thick, oily smoke that fills the tent and clings to the walls. Then the sound. Not your scream. That came earlier. This is a wet sizzle, a grotesque fizzling like meat left too long on the fire. Your flesh bubbles, chars, hardens. Sometimes the iron sticks. Sometimes it has to be pulled free, peeling skin with it. And yet, this was considered advanced, smart, even merciful, because the alternative was continued bleeding, infection, and death. At least with cautery, you stood a chance. A terrible, agonizing, scorched chance. Medieval medics believed the flame cleansed, that it scared away demons, disease, and decay. Never mind that it left you with nerve damage, disfigurement, and pain so deep it echoed. They didn't limit this to amputation wounds either. Nosebleeds, burn the inside of the nostril, tooth infection. Heat a rod and jab the jaw. Open sore on your chest, burn a circle around it. It didn't matter where or how. If you were leaking, the iron was coming, and every time you screamed, or you didn't, because you'd already passed out, or your body simply gave up. Cauterization wasn't just a treatment. It was a ritual of pain, a ceremony where fire became both surgeon and executioner. You emerged alive, if lucky, but always marked by scars, by trauma, and by the knowledge that fire had once kissed your flesh and stayed too long. You have a headache, not the mild kind, the thunderous, world-ending kind. Maybe it came from a blow to the head during battle, maybe from swelling, seizures, or unseen trauma. In today's world, they'd give you a scan, maybe some meds, monitor your brain. In the Middle Ages, they reached for a drill. Trepanation, the ancient, revered, and horrifying art of opening the human skull. It sounds surgical. It wasn't. It was guesswork with a chisel. They believed pressure in the skull caused madness, convulsions, or demonic possession. The cure? Let it out. Like steam from a boiling pot. So they cut. Through hair, scalp, and then, yes, bone. First came the scalp incision, done with a knife no cleaner than the floor. Then the scraping began, with a blade, or a sharpened rock, or a primitive trephine, a circular tool used to scrape the skull away, layer by layer. No anesthesia, no sedation. You were awake, fully, screaming, convulsing, or worse, silent, staring, already too far gone to protest. If you could speak, they ignored you. If you fought, they tied you down. And as the tool grated over your skull, the pain wasn't just local, it was cosmic. Your whole body trembled, your teeth clenched, you bit your tongue bloody. They kept going. Then came the moment. The skull gave way, a soft give, a tiny opening. Success. They didn't go for the brain, just the bone. That was mercy, if you can call it that. But infection followed, always. The open skull invited everything in. Flies, dirt, pus, rain, worse. They'd cover it with cloth soaked in wine or urine, maybe a cap of wax or lead. And then they waited. Survival. Surprisingly, some did. Bones show signs of healing. A small number even recovered fully, if fully means not immediately dying. But many others fell into fever, seizures, coma. The brain swelled. The wound turned black. And death came quietly. Days later, under straw, eyes wide open. Trepanation wasn't a last resort. It was standard. Practiced across cultures, used on everyone from peasants to royalty. It wasn't always fatal, but it was always traumatic. The act of slicing into a skull wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, a brutal blend of medicine, religion, and raw, desperate hope. When they reached for the drill, you knew something terrible was happening. And what came next? A hole in your head, and a new chapter of pain. The bleeding's slowed. The burning's done. You're not dead yet. Now comes the next medieval marvel: stitching the wound. A process so crude, so unsanitary, it might have been better to leave the gash open and pray the wind dried it shut, because in the world of battlefield surgery, stitches weren't neat, they weren't sterile, and they definitely weren't gentle. First, the thread. Not nylon, not silk, not anything clean. Stitches were done with whatever was available: animal sinew, horsehair, human hair, or thick linen coated in wax, blood, or whatever was clinging to the medic's hands. Sometimes it was soaked in wine to clean it. Other times it was darkened with ash or soot, because yes, that was considered disinfectant. In reality, it just made the infection harder to spot. Next came the needle, a curved piece of bone or metal, often thick, always blunt. It tore more than it threaded. There was no concept of spacing, depth, or alignment. Stitches were jammed through flesh with trembling fingers and muttered curses. The goal wasn't aesthetics. It wasn't even healing. It was keeping the pieces of your body from falling apart long enough for the fever to decide what happened next. The pain. Exquisite. The knife had cut. The saw had screamed. But the needle, it dragged. Slowly, tugging skin, pulling it tight, knotting it wrong. Each pass a tiny punch to your nervous system. You clenched your teeth. You shook. Some passed out before the stitching even finished. Others watched every agonizing pull, breath hitching with each knot. And there was no aftercare. Once stitched, you were patched and forgotten. The wound might swell. It might split back open. The stitches might rot, snap, or dissolve inside your skin. They weren't removed. They just fell out eventually, or got pushed out by swelling flesh. If the wound got infected, the whole process might be repeated, or worse, they'd slice the stitches open again and start fresh. Infections ran rampant. Stitching without cleaning the wound just trapped the disease inside. Abscesses grew. Pus burst through the seams. Skin turned red, purple, black. The stitches that once held you together became the lines that mapped your descent into sepsis. And those who survived bore the evidence for life. Twisted seams, jagged scars, skin that healed in lumpy folds or never closed at all. There was no pride in being stitched. It was just another step in the long, ugly attempt at survival. A gamble played with bone needles, dirty thread, and whatever passed for hope in the filth-stained corners of a battlefield tent. You hear the moans before you see the place. A tent, if you can call it that. Patchworked cloth, sagging posts, no floor. Just mud and old blood soaked into the dirt. The smell hits next. A punch of sweat, rot, excrement, and something metallic. You gag, but there's no time. You're shoved through the flap and dumped onto straw already soaked with someone else's misery. Welcome. This is your hospital. There are no clean sheets, no fresh gowns, no soap. Just bodies, stacked, sprawled, groaning. Some alive, some not. And in the middle of it all, the surgeon. He moves from one body to the next with a set of knives tied to his belt and a cloth wrapped around his mouth, not to protect you, but to block the smell. His hands, already soaked in blood from whoever screamed last. He won't wash them. There's no water for that. Water's for drinking, if it isn't already laced with filth. The beds are straw, sometimes moss, maybe cloth rags if the patient before you bled out fast enough to free them up. You share the space with rats, fleas, flies, and the chorus of dying men crying for mothers long gone. Some don't cry anymore. Their mouths hang open. Their eyes stay fixed on the ceiling. No one moves them. No one can. Treatment is random. A wound might get bandaged or ignored. A fever might be blessed with prayer or leeches. The stench of rotting limbs fills the air. Some are amputated and tossed into a pile outside. Others are left attached, black and stinking, until they fall off or the patient expires. You hope for attention. You fear it, too. The food? Gruel, cold, often spoiled, delivered by someone who doesn't want to come any closer than necessary. Clean water? Maybe, if the last guy didn't spit in the bucket. Sanitation? Laughable. Piss flows down the corner, vomits wiped with a sleeve. Open wounds left uncovered attract flies, maggots, and disease with horrifying efficiency. And the noise. Oh, the noise. Screams, whimpers, gurgling breaths, coughs that shake entire bunks. The muttering of prayers. The frantic scratching of lice-ridden men. The soft slap of flesh being sliced. The clatter of bones as a body is dragged away. You don't sleep. You drift. In and out of awareness. Half dreaming, half dying. Waiting to know which side you'll land on. This isn't a place for healing. It's a waiting room for death. A warehouse for the wounded. A grim purgatory where recovery is rare and hope is rationed like clean linen. The battlefield was chaos. But the hospital? The hospital was hell. You're lying in the blood-matted straw, delirious, wound pulsing, vision swimming. And suddenly you realize the man with the scalpel isn't just covered in blood. He's wearing shackles, iron ones, chained at the ankle. You blink. Maybe you're hallucinating. Maybe not. Because in some medieval battlefields, the surgeon wasn't just unqualified. He was a convict. That's right. Prisoners, thieves, murderers, and drunks were sometimes forced into medical service. Not because they were skilled, but because no one else wanted the job. The work was dangerous, disgusting, and soul-destroying. The logic went something like this. If you were already condemned, cutting off limbs was your path to redemption, or at least your sentence reduction. You didn't have to be smart. You just had to be willing to get your hands dirty and not vomit too quickly. These chained surgeons were often taken from prisons near the front lines. They were offered tools, minimal training, and patience. Lots of them. What they lacked in hygiene or ethics, they made up for in aggression. Because if you're used to stabbing people in taverns, sawing through someone's arm on the battlefield doesn't seem that outrageous, especially if it means you get fed. Some did it to survive. Others enjoyed it far too much. There were stories of laughing butchers, men who grinned as they cut, who took pride in how quickly they could remove a leg. They bragged about speed, like modern surgeons brag about precision. Fast meant efficient. Fast meant fewer screams, maybe. Fast meant less time to think about what you were doing, and they weren't watched. Not really. The military didn't have the manpower to supervise. As long as the wounded were being treated, nobody cared. Whether a man lived or died was secondary. Whether the treatment was humane, completely irrelevant. Their tools were stolen, borrowed, or improvised. Some used broken blades. Others had twisted metal they'd sharpened on stones. There was no inventory, no sterilization. Just a sack of dirty instruments and a man with a shackle scraping a wound open to drain the evil. The chains didn't slow them down. If anything, they gave the scene a certain rhythm, metal clinking with every step, every slice, every turn to the next patient. It was almost musical in a macabre sort of way. And the patients? They had no say, no options. They were lucky someone was even trying to help them. Whether that help came from a skilled monk or a shackled killer with a blade, didn't matter. Desperation has a way of blurring moral lines. So yes, Some battlefield surgeons were literally in chains. But so were their patients, chained to pain, to suffering, to the brutal lottery of medieval survival. And on that battlefield, mercy was a luxury, not a profession. There's a saying on the battlefield, lose a limb, save a life. Except no one talks about the rest of that sentence. The part where you spin the wheel of medieval medicine and hope you're not the one who draws bleed out in agony, or dies screaming of sepsis 3 days later. Amputation wasn't a decision. It was a gamble, and every roll was soaked in blood. The reasons were usually grim and obvious. A limb crushed by a mace, an arrow splitting bone, a sword slicing deep through muscle and tendon. When a limb was too far gone, the only treatment was removal. Fast, before rot set in, before the fever claimed you, before the wound started smelling like something already buried. So out came the saw. There was no consensus on where to cut. Some surgeons went above the wound, way above. Others tried to save as much as possible, slicing dangerously close to infection. It was a judgment call made in a tent reeking of urine and fear. The wrong decision meant you'd die slower, but you'd still die. And the technique? Brutal. Tourniquets made from belts or strips of leather were tied above the limb. You'd be given a stick to bite. A few men would hold you down. And then the sawing began. It wasn't precise. It wasn't clean. The blade snagged. The surgeon grunted. Blood sprayed in hot arcs across the tent. You screamed. You thrashed. You felt everything. Sometimes the bone shattered mid-cut. Then the surgeon had to finish the job with a hammer and chisel. The stump, raw and gaping, was then either cauterized with hot iron or packed with herbs, wine, moss, anything close enough to medicine. Bandages were wrapped hastily, usually with cloth already used on someone else. Then you were laid down to wait. Some patients lost one limb. Some lost two. Others more. There was no upper limit. Some surgeons believed in removing multiple limbs in one session to save time. These people often didn't make it. Shock set in. Fever followed. And by the time the bandages turned black, the soul was already halfway out the door. But even if you lived, life didn't exactly get better. Mobility aids were a joke. Crude crutches, wooden legs with no hinges, wheels made of warped wood, and you weren't treated as a hero. You were seen as broken, a reminder of war's cost, sometimes pitied, more often avoided. Amputation wasn't just a treatment. It was a trial, a punishment handed out by metal and muscle, decided not by your worth, but by your wound. And the roulette wheel kept spinning, because on the medieval battlefield, losing a limb was better than losing your life, but just barely. The blade cut deep, but that wasn't what killed you. The arrow lodged in your thigh, the spear to the gut, the dagger in the ribs. None of those were the real executioners. Those were just the opening acts. What truly ended you, what claimed more lives than any weapon ever forged, was the invisible army crawling through your wounds. Bacteria, filth, infection. The medieval battlefield wasn't a place of steel and glory. It was a festering petri dish where the true killers were too small to see and absolutely everywhere. The moment your skin broke, they invaded. Through dirt, blood, mud, manure. Through the surgeon's filthy hands, his gore-crusted tools, the reused bandages, the festering cloth dragged from one patient to the next. They lived on the blades. They lived in the straw. They lived in the warm, dark places of your body, where blood pooled and oxygen faded. You didn't know their names. No one did. But you felt their work, fever, swelling, the slow rot that started at the edges and moved in like a siege. Wounds weren't cleaned. They were wiped. Maybe doused in wine, if you were lucky, and the surgeon wasn't already drunk on it. Even clean water was usually just a broth of river muck, dead animal runoff, and someone's chamber pot upstream. When a medic cut into you, he wasn't just opening flesh. He was planting a garden of infection, watering it with sweat and fear, and praying something else killed you first. Tetanus, gangrene, septicemia. These were the silent killers, the creeping curses. You wouldn't know them by name, but you'd know their signs. Jaw clenched until it cracked. Muscles spasming uncontrollably. A wound that turned black overnight, stinking of meat left too long in the sun. Blood that stopped clotting. Skin that blistered, cracked, and wept without end. You'd sweat through your rags, shake through the nights. Your breathing would slow, your eyes would glaze, and the people around you would just step back, because they knew. This wasn't something the surgeon could fix, and he didn't try. Not really. He'd pat your shoulder, tell you to rest, maybe call for a priest. You'd be laid on your side, not because it was comfortable, but because it made it easier to carry you out once you stopped moving. You were already lost, and so many died that way, days, even weeks after their wounds. Not from steel, but from what followed. Swords may have pierced skin, but bacteria pierced time. They claimed the aftermath. Quiet, ruthless, thorough. And for every man who fell in battle, 5 more rotted away behind the lines, unseen, unsung, undone by things the eye couldn't see and the mind couldn't yet grasp. He's conscious, breathing. The wound doesn't look too deep. The bleeding's slowed. Everyone nods. The worst is over, they say. He'll be fine. Words that in medieval medicine were less a reassurance and more a curse, because the second someone said them out loud, it meant death had already noticed. And now it was just deciding how long it wanted to wait. The battlefield was filled with these false comforts. A man missing fingers, he'll be fine. A soldier coughing up blood after a blow to the ribs, probably just a bruise. Someone with a clean-looking stab to the belly, no external bleeding. Surely he's lucky. No one realized that internal injuries were just time bombs, blood filling the gut, lungs collapsing, organs shutting down one by one. You could be sitting up, talking, smiling even, then slumped over dead an hour later. He looks strong was another common lie. Strong meant nothing when your body was silently rotting. Some of the fittest, most hardened warriors dropped dead days after being wounded. Their strength didn't matter. Infection didn't care how many battles you'd survived. Tetanus didn't flinch at biceps. Septicemia didn't negotiate. And then there was the dangerous calm, the quiet before the storm. A man would stop screaming. His breathing would slow. His skin would pale. They called it turning a corner. And in a way, he had. Just not toward healing, toward the grave. But in those moments of silence, medics relaxed. Soldiers laughed. They told stories. They made promises. And the dying man, eyes fluttering, might even whisper, "I think I'm going to make it." 10 minutes later, he'd be gone. The problem wasn't just the lack of knowledge. It was the hope. Hope that a man who survived the blade wouldn't be undone by what followed. That a patch of herbs, a prayer, and a splash of vinegar could ward off death. But death didn't care about effort. It cared about blood in the wrong places, fevers unchecked, bacteria thriving where it shouldn't. "He'll be fine" became a battlefield mantra, said to soothe, said to lie, said when nothing else could be done. and the men who heard it often died with it still ringing in their ears, believing they might see tomorrow, even as their bodies were already giving up. So no, he wasn't fine. He was never fine. He was just the next name to be whispered, buried, and forgotten. You didn't die. Not yet. You survived the blade, the saw, the burn, the fever. You've been cut open, stitched shut, wrapped in rags and soaked in sweat. They say you're healing. They say recovery has begun. But here's the medieval definition of recovery. You're no longer actively screaming, and you haven't turned black in the last 12 hours. That's it. That's the metric. Your bed is a damp mat of straw that hasn't been changed since someone else bled out on it 2 days ago. Flies buzz constantly. You've killed 3 rats with your bare hands. A 4th one bit your toe while you were drifting in and out of a fever dream. One of your wounds is itching. That's good, they say. It means it's coming back to life. Never mind that it's probably lice, or infection, or something worse that doesn't have a name yet. Food? A thin gruel that tastes like regret and boiled despair. Water? Sometimes. If it hasn't been used to rinse out a bucket first. Sanitation is still a myth. Chamber pots overflow. Pus-stained bandages pile up like ghostly trophies. You're surrounded by other recovering patients. Men who groan all night, who talk to the walls, who bleed through their sheets and insist they're getting better. The rot creeps in quietly. You feel it in your breath, in your bones, in the way your limbs throb at night. The air smells thick, like sweat, mold, and something beneath the floor that no one dares dig up. When the wind shifts, you smell the limb pile outside. It's growing again. Your bandages haven't been changed in days. No one has the time. The surgeon passed by yesterday, looked at your leg, shrugged, and muttered something about God's will. The stitches have gone soft. The skin around them is puffy and pink, hot to the touch. You ask for help. Someone nods. Nothing happens. There are moments of silence, not peace, just the absence of screams. Then the moaning returns. A fevered man laughs until he cries. Another one hasn't blinked in hours. No one wants to sit beside him anymore. He's too quiet. That means he's next. And yet, you're still here. You've lived longer than expected. That makes you a survivor. Not a healthy one. Not a whole one. But someone who's managed to drag themselves 1 inch further than the grave. You're recovering, they say. But there's no comfort in it. Because here, recovery isn't a return to life. It's just a slower march toward the same ending. You've done it. Against all odds, you've survived the sword, the saw, the fire, the fever. You've been declared healed, which in medieval terms means you're not actively dying in front of anyone. They hand you a crutch, pat your back, push you out of the tent. You blink in the daylight, unsure what happens next. Here's the truth. You're alive, but not for long. Because survival on paper doesn't mean survival in practice. Your wounds are barely closed. The infections have retreated, not disappeared. You haven't eaten properly in weeks. Your body is cannibalizing itself, muscle stripped from your limbs, skin hanging loose over bones. You're so weak you can't hold a sword, can't lift a bucket, can't walk more than a few feet before the world starts spinning. And out there's no safety net, no rehabilitation, no food waiting, no warm bed, no home in many cases. You might be sent back to your village if it still exists. You might be given a coin and a prayer. More often, you're left to wander, limping, starving, coughing up whatever's still festering in your chest. A walking reminder of the war, an embarrassment to those still fighting, a ghost with a heartbeat. Your injuries linger, nerves misfire, your leg aches where it no longer exists. Your arm, twisted from poor setting, will never fully bend again. You get cold easily. You sleep in fits. You flinch when someone touches you. You smell of rot because some wounds still haven't healed. The town healer tells you it's normal. He hands you herbs. They don't help. You're a burden now. You can't work the fields. You can't fight. You're too slow, too sick, too strange. The looks from others are mixed. Pity, fear, sometimes disgust. They see your bandages and flinch. They see your missing fingers and look away. You sit by the fire and tell stories of what happened out there. No one listens. And you know something they don't. You know that the wound never really closes. It just scabs over until something knocks it open again. A cold snap, a fever, a scratch that doesn't stop bleeding. Death didn't want you then, but it still circles, waiting. You survived the battlefield, yes, but peace, it turns out, is even more dangerous. Because here, survival isn't a triumph, it's just a delay. And you're not healed, you're haunted. Your leg is gone, but you still feel it, not vaguely, not metaphorically. You feel it burning, you feel the toes curling. You feel a cramp in the calf that doesn't exist anymore. And when you wake from shallow fevered sleep, you try to scratch it, only to find empty air and bandage stump. The limb is gone, but the pain remains, and it's worse than before. Medieval medicine had no name for this. No term like phantom limb. No neurological explanation. To them, this was witchcraft, a curse, a punishment from God. Some believed it was the soul trying to reclaim the missing part. Others said demons lived in the stump and whispered pain through your nerves. You said nothing. You just screamed. The pain wasn't dull. It wasn't nostalgic. It was sharp, biting, insistent. It flared in cold weather, in silence, in dreams. It pulsed like it had a heartbeat. You might beat your stump with your fist just to make it stop, or press it against a fire, or beg the healer to cut more off, anything to silence the ghost limb screaming inside you. No one understood. Not really. They thought you were mad, delirious. You were told to pray harder, to repent. Some even accused you of faking, seeking sympathy, pity, alms. But you didn't want charity. You wanted sleep. You wanted silence. You wanted 1 hour where the pain wasn't lying to your brain. And for many, it didn't stop. It followed them to their graves. Years later, men were still rubbing empty sleeves, still limping on missing feet, still hearing the echo of a war that never left their bodies. The battlefield wasn't behind them. It was under their skin. Some tried folk remedies, powdered bone, crushed wormwood, leeches on the stump. One man tried to exercise his leg by tying a crucifix to it. Nothing worked, because the pain wasn't in the body. It was in the nerves, the brain, a system no one understood. And without understanding, there was no cure, just survival and screaming. Phantom pain wasn't called that. It wasn't poetic. It was hell. A slow burning fire in a place that no longer existed. And in a world where pain meant punishment, these men lived not just with trauma, but with blame. Because if they were still hurting, then surely it must be their fault. And that was the worst wound of all. You need to move, not far, just a few feet, to water, to warmth, to anything. But your leg is gone, and your body refuses to cooperate. You look around. No one is coming. There are no wheelchairs, no support rails, no physical therapy. Just mud, your own trembling hands, and a stick you found behind the tent. Congratulations, you've just invented your crutch. In the Middle Ages, mobility aids weren't designed. They were improvised. Crutches were made from snapped branches, broken spear shafts, chair legs, even pieces of cart axle. No padding, no ergonomic grips. Just wood against skin, splinters in armpits, bruises on palms. You didn't lean, you clung. You didn't walk, you dragged. If you were wealthy, you might have a carpenter fashion something custom, a carved staff, a set of crutches lashed with leather straps. But if you were a soldier, a peasant, anyone who had to crawl out of the tent on your own, you made do, 2 sticks and a prayer. They didn't last. The wood rotted. The joints snapped. They collapsed when you needed them most. And there was no backup. If a crutch broke, so did your independence. You were stuck again, on the ground, crawling through filth like a wounded animal. There were no leg braces, no prosthetics that functioned beyond crude appearance. Wooden peg legs were often more dangerous than useful. Misaligned, unbalanced, painful. Each step sent jolts up the spine. Falls were common. Infection even more so when splinters dug into stumps already struggling to close. Some men resorted to crawling, dragging themselves across floors, roads, thresholds. Their clothes stained, their skin raw. It was humbling. It was degrading. And society didn't help. You weren't seen as a hero. You were an obstacle, in the way, a burden. Children stared. Adults looked through you. And through it all, you kept trying to stand, to move, because staying still was worse. Staying still meant surrender. And even though your limbs had betrayed you, your will hadn't, yet. So you built your crutch, over and over, stick by stick, nail by nail, no blueprints, no glory, just the desperate need to keep going, when your body no longer could. You've survived the blade, the fever, the saw. Now you're in the final phase, recovery. But your wound won't close. The pain won't leave. Your appetite is gone. You're still coughing up black phlegm and seeing shadows that aren't there. There's no doctor coming. Instead, an old woman walks in holding a bundle of herbs tied with twine and a look of tired conviction. She says, "It will help." You don't know what it is, and at this point, you don't care. Welcome to the wild gamble of medieval herbal medicine. Equal parts hope, tradition, and sheer guesswork. Herbs were the cornerstones of treatment for those who had nothing else. Sometimes they saved lives. Sometimes they ended them faster. There was no standard dose, no measuring spoons, just leaves, roots, and instructions passed down through whispers and folklore. Your healer might give you wormwood, comfrey, or yarrow, or they might confuse belladonna for mint. The difference: one might ease your fever, the other might stop your heart. The line between remedy and poison was razor thin. Willow bark could dull pain, if it didn't trigger vomiting. Poppy made you sleep, but too much could silence your lungs. Foxglove, now known for its cardiac effects, was used by some for bad spirits in the chest. It also killed indiscriminately when overused, but no one was taking notes. No one knew the chemical properties. They just saw what happened after, if anything happened at all. Application methods were equally varied. Some poultices were mashed into a hot paste and slapped directly onto open wounds. Others were soaked in wine or goat urine, then wrapped around infected limbs like a stinking herbal tortilla. Teas were brewed in soot-blackened kettles and forced down your throat while you groaned. Steam baths, smoke fanning, ash blowing into nostrils, all counted as treatment. And if herbs didn't work, blame didn't fall on the medicine. It fell on you. You were too weak, too sinful. The herbs were fine. You just didn't believe hard enough. Some herbalists had genuine talent, an intuitive knowledge of plants, seasons, and symptoms, but they were rare. Most copied what they'd been told, mixing ingredients blindly, and if a patient died, that recipe was quietly retired. Maybe. So you swallowed the potion. You took the tea. You wore the poultice, not because it was guaranteed to work, but because it was all that was left. In the hands of a skilled herbalist, nature offered salvation. In the hands of a desperate one, it offered hallucinations, seizures, and a slower, more confusing death. The herbs might help, or they might not. Either way, you'd find out soon enough. You're burning with fever. Your wound smells like death. The last poultice made your skin blister. The surgeon's gone. The herbalist is out of ideas, so they send for someone else, the village priest. He arrives with a cross in one hand, holy water in the other, and zero medical experience. But in the Middle Ages, that didn't matter, because in many places, especially the poor and war-torn, the priest was the doctor. Medicine and religion weren't separate. They were tangled, inseparable, indistinguishable. Illness was considered divine punishment, a test of faith, a curse for sin. And so priests weren't just healers of the soul. They were tasked with healing the flesh, too, with prayer, with ritual, with whatever was scribbled in the monastery's crumbling copy of Galen's Anatomy, written centuries ago, never updated, mostly guesswork. The treatment begins with confession. You must cleanse your soul before your body can recover. Have you lied, cheated, skipped mass, dreamed impure thoughts while bleeding from the thigh? Every sin, no matter how small, is catalogued. Your fever worsens while they wait for you to repent. Once you confess, the priest offers absolution, and maybe a ritual. This could involve sprinkling holy water on the wound, already oozing, already raw. Maybe a relic is placed on your chest. Maybe you're anointed with oil or blood or ash. Incense might be waved over your bed. Psalms chanted until your eyes roll back. If you convulse, they say it's working. If you stop breathing, they say your soul was ready. Actual medical intervention is rare. Priests weren't trained to cut, only to bless. But in some monasteries they doubled as caregivers. Monks would tend to wounds, mix ointments, and read aloud from ancient medical texts written in Latin. But again, these were guesses preserved in ink. No one knew how the body really worked. They just followed tradition, and tradition didn't evolve. It just calcified. The worst part, people trusted them, not because they were good, but because they were the only option. In many villages, the priest was the most educated person alive. If he said your cough was caused by demons, you believed him. If he said bloodletting would rebalance your soul, you offered your arm. And if he said your suffering was divine judgment, you simply accepted it. You came for healing. What you got was theology with a side of salt and shadow. You weren't a patient. You were a sinner. And sickness was just the invoice. The wound is black at the edges. Your fever rises and falls like a dying tide. No one knows what's wrong, but they all agree it must be spiritual. So someone mutters a prayer and runs to fetch the priest. He returns with a clay vial of holy water, scooped from a basin, blessed hours ago, already cloudy with dust and backwash. He dips his fingers in, shakes the droplets onto your forehead, and murmurs something in Latin. It does nothing. Holy water wasn't medicine, but in the Middle Ages it was a frontline treatment. When pain defied explanation, when wounds festered, when fevers raged, when madness set in, faith filled the void left by ignorance. Holy water became the default prescription. It was easier than cutting, safer than herbs, more accessible than leeches. It was hope, bottled and blessed. The ritual was simple. Sprinkle the water. Say the words. Cross the forehead, the chest, the wound. Sometimes they added salt. Sometimes oil. Sometimes tears. Then they waited for signs. A calming breath. A moment of stillness. A miracle. But if none came, they just repeated the ritual. Again and again, until your pulse faded or your soul gave up. They didn't wash wounds with it. That wasn't the point. Holy water wasn't about cleaning the body. It was about purging the unseen. Sin, demons, curses. It was thought to ward off plague, madness, and death itself. It didn't, but belief was stronger than reason, especially when there was no reason left. When the Black Death swept through, people lined up for sprinkles. Soldiers on the battlefield begged for it before surgery. Mothers wept over children, dousing them with it as they convulsed from infection. And the priests? They poured and prayed and looked to the sky, waiting for a change that never came. In some places, it was even weaponized, thrown at the sick, as if disease could be banished by splash. Patients choking on their own blood were forced to drink it. Wounds were anointed with it, no matter how raw. And when that failed, the water was blamed for not being holy enough, as if God had dialed down the dosage. You don't feel different. If anything, you feel worse. The fever is higher. Your breath rattles. But no one reaches for herbs or stitches or fire. They just nod solemnly and say, "We've done what we can." You're drenched in hope. But hope is not healing, and holy water won't help. The battlefield was loud, swords shouting, chaos. But the tents behind it? Louder, and far more terrifying. That's where the real horror unfolded. Not in the charge of knights or the clash of steel, but in the shrieks of the wounded, the wails of the dying, and the sick, bone-deep groans of men begging for mercy that would never come. You can hear it before you even step inside. Screams of all kinds, short and sharp, like someone bitten, long and drawn out, like someone being cut, moans that bubble with blood, whispers muttered through clenched teeth, gasps that sound like drowning. It's a symphony of suffering, and it never stops. Night doesn't help. If anything, it's worse. In the dark, the pain sharpens. No one can sleep. No one dares. Shadows play tricks. A nearby scream becomes your scream. You imagine the saw coming for you next. A man thrashes in his fevered cot, knocking over candles. Another claws at his own stitches, trying to pull the rot out with his fingers. Someone sobs for their mother. Another begs for death. Surgeons shout orders. Assistants stumble through the blood, their boots sticking to the floor. The iron for cauterizing glows in the corner, casting hellish shadows. A man is screaming now, a high-pitched, raw scream that cuts through everything. You know what that means. Another amputation. You look away, but the sound drills into your ears, sticks in your memory like splinters. Every patient becomes a prophet of pain. Their cries predict what's coming for you. The one who screams before the saw, he's strong. The one who goes silent halfway through, he's gone. You begin to dread the quiet more than the screams. Silence means another soul has left the tent. You learn to recognize voices, the ones who last hours, the ones who fade fast. The ones who cry out in languages you don't know, but the meaning is always the same. Please make it stop. And no one can. The medics try to drown it out with orders. The monks chant. The priests pray louder. But the pain is too loud. It doesn't care. Even the walls groan. The wind through the canvas sounds like breath. The flapping of torn fabric sounds like footsteps. You lie there, one good arm covering your ears. But it's useless. The screams get in anyway. Through the cloth, through the straw, through your skin. This isn't a hospital. It's a hive of agony, a living, breathing nightmare. And until death finally comes, yours or someone else's, those screams will never stop echoing. You were promised healing. You were promised rest. What you got was a stone room, damp walls, no sunlight, and the sound of water dripping endlessly in the distance. Welcome to recovery, medieval edition. You're not in a hospital anymore. You're in a repurposed cellar, basement, or storage hole that someone decided was good enough to house the half-dead. You're not surrounded by clean sheets. You're surrounded by darkness, rats, and your own breath echoing off cold rock. These recovery chambers weren't sanctuaries. They were holding pens for the barely alive. Monasteries, castles, and makeshift war hospitals didn't have recovery wings. They had unused spaces, unlit corners, crypts that hadn't seen burials in a while. You were lowered there, sometimes literally. No railing, no support. Just a rope or a few helping hands that hoped not to drop you. The air is always moist. Mold blooms in the cracks. The straw on the floor smells like old milk and rot. The walls sweat. At night, the room fills with snoring, gasping, moaning. Someone's always coughing. Someone's always crying. There are no windows, only torches that smoke more than they illuminate. If you didn't come here with lung rot, you'll leave with it. And you're not alone. Other patients groan beside you. Some recovering, some not. Some whispering to things that aren't there. Others long dead, their bodies not yet removed because no one noticed. The rats do, though. They're the night shift. Bold, fearless, curious. They don't care that you're still breathing. They've already started nibbling at the edges of bandages. And fingers. Food, if you get it, comes cold. Sometimes moldy. Water drips from the ceiling or is handed to you in a filthy bowl. There is no schedule. No one checks your wounds regularly. You either heal on your own or you don't. And time slips. No clocks, no sun. Just endless groaning and the sound of your own thoughts getting louder. You start to dream with your eyes open. You start to forget how long you've been here. You start to forget what quiet felt like. This isn't recovery. It's punishment with a pulse. A dungeon where pain doesn't end. It just slows down. Where every breath is a gamble and every step forward is made in the dark. The sword didn't kill you. The saw didn't kill you, but this room, it might. Not because of injury, but because of despair. They unwrap your wound. The cloth peels back slowly, crackling as dried blood pulls away from raw skin. It smells like infection. It looks worse. But no one gasps. No one flinches. Because this is normal. You've been bandaged with whatever they could find. Old linen, ripped tunics, wool scraps, someone's discarded undergarment. Welcome to the fabric of medieval medicine, where what covers your wound might be dirtier than the wound itself. There was no sterile gauze, no antiseptic pads, no single-use rolls of clean cotton. Bandages were made of whatever was nearby, and more importantly, available. Did it absorb blood? Did it kind of hold together? Could you tie it into a knot? Perfect. It was a bandage now. They weren't cleaned between uses. At best, they were dunked in water. At worst, they were used as is, pulled off one corpse and slapped onto the next body in line. If a cloth was soaked through, they didn't remove it. They added another layer. Soon, wounds were wrapped in thick, wet mounds of linen, reeking of old blood, sweat, pus, and failure. The rot soaked deeper with every hour. Some believed adding moss or animal fat made it medicinal. Others sprinkled herbs into the folds, lavender, thyme, even ashes. Did it help? Maybe, maybe not, but it hid the smell. Sometimes. Other times, it just made the wound harder to monitor. Once covered, no one wanted to look at it again. Bandage changes weren't regular. They happened when you complained loudly enough, or when the smell became too much, and changing them hurt. Cloth fused to scabs, threads embedded in skin. Removing it was like peeling away your recovery, one gasp at a time. Worse, the materials often caused more harm. Rough wool rubbed raw skin into open sores. Some cloths introduced lice, maggots, or mold. And some wounds simply never healed, bandaged and rebandaged until they became part of the cloth itself. In the end, your bandages told your story, not one of healing, but of desperation, of war, of the last shirt off someone's back turned into a half-hearted prayer against death. They wrapped you in rags not to save you, but to delay the inevitable. You weren't healed. You were wrapped, mummified in regret and tied with string. You wake up, still alive. That's the good news. The bad news is the smell. It hits you like a fist before your eyes even open. Not one scent, but a war of them. Blood that's turned sour, old sweat soaked into wool, the sharp tang of infected wounds, the earthy musk of unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable reek of human waste. Survival, it turns out, has an odor, and it's unbearable. There are no soaps, no perfumes, no fresh linen. The straw beneath you is damp and sour. The man beside you hasn't moved in days, and whatever's leaking from him is pooling toward your cot. The bandage on your leg stinks like a dead dog. Your breath smells of infection, and your skin has taken on that greasy, fevered shine that no water seems to wash away. And yet, no one comments. No one recoils, because everyone smells. The entire tent, dungeon, or barracks reeks. Flies buzz like they've bought tickets to a festival. Some wounds emit such foulness that others are moved away, not to help them, but to help everyone else keep their food down. Rot, decay, death. It clings to everything. Even the walls seem to sweat with it. Clothes are never changed, not because you don't want to, but because you can't. You don't have another tunic. The one you wore into battle is the one you're wrapped in now. Blood-stiffened, urine-soaked, torn and burned. Your boots, if you still have them, are caked with mud, excrement, and blood. Taking them off would peel skin with them, so you don't. You just lie in your own stench. When a breeze comes through, it doesn't bring relief. It just stirs the odors like a pot, redistributing the misery. When someone dies, the smell lingers. The body may be gone, but its scent remains, trapped in the cloth, the air, the memory. Every time you breathe, you taste it. Every sip of water, every bite of food carries it with it. It seeps into your skin, into your thoughts. And after a while, the worst part isn't the stench itself. It's the way you get used to it. How the shock wears off. How your brain stops protesting. How you accept it as the new normal. This is what survival smells like. Not clean bandages or antiseptic. Not spring water and fresh bread. It smells like meat gone bad, like sweat, blood, and hopelessness cooked under canvas. You've lived. But now you live in it, in a cloud of decay, a fog of failure, a reek that tells you every second you might have survived the battle, but you didn't escape it. You made it home, or at least away from the battlefield. Your wounds have mostly closed. Your fever has faded. You've survived what should have killed you. But something's wrong. The war isn't over. Not for you. You hear the screams at night. You feel the saw in your sleep. You flinch when someone speaks too loudly, when a dog barks, when a cartwheel snaps over a stone. You don't feel healed. You feel haunted. But in the Middle Ages, there's no name for this. No diagnosis. No support. No word like trauma. No phrase like post-traumatic stress. You're just troubled, unsettled, maybe touched by demons, or worse, coward. They don't see your shaking hands or sleepless nights as injuries. They see them as weakness, a failing of character, a spiritual flaw. You stop talking about it, because when you did, people looked at you differently. They whispered, they prayed over you, or they avoided you altogether. You tried to act normal, but normal left you on the battlefield. Now you're a stranger in your own skin. You get angry easily, or you don't feel anything at all. You can't sit in silence, or you can't stand noise. Either way, you don't belong anywhere. You avoid firelight. It reminds you of cauterization. You can't stand the sound of chopping wood. It echoes like a bone being sawed. You haven't slept through the night in months. You dream of tents, of screams, of staring eyes and severed limbs. You dream of yourself, broken and begging. Sometimes, when you wake, you're already crying, and no one understands. Why would they? They never saw the inside of the surgeon's tent, never smelled the iron cooking flesh, never watched a man die with his own foot still in his hands. They tell you to move on, to be thankful, to get over it. But you can't, because the wound in your mind never closed. It bleeds in silence, unseen. You're praised as a survivor, but inside you know better. Something in you died out there, and now you're just pretending to live. There's no balm for it, no priest's prayer, no herbal tea. You carry it everywhere, behind your eyes, under your breath, inside your heartbeat. They call it madness. You call it memory. They say you're lucky, but luck wouldn't leave you this hollow. You left the battlefield alive, but not whole. You were stitched, burned, prayed over, and left to rot slowly in a corner of a tent. You survived. You recovered. But what happens next depends on who you ask. Some say you were healed. Others say you were marked. And some, especially the ones who hear you mutter to yourself at night, say you were haunted. In the Middle Ages, there wasn't a clean break between physical wounds and spiritual scars. Pain was never just pain. If you walked with a limp, people assumed God was still punishing you. If you trembled, stammered, or screamed in your sleep, they said a demon had attached itself to your soul during surgery. You didn't get sympathy. You got suspicion. Many of the healed became wanderers, men who drifted from village to village, half recognized, half feared. They told stories no one wanted to hear, described things too horrible to process. They wept in the middle of markets. They talked to the dead. They begged at church steps while mothers pulled children away. You weren't a war hero. You were a walking omen. Some turned to drink, others to the church. A few tried to bury it all, start families, raise crops, pretend they hadn't watched a friend choke on his own tongue while being bled out under a tarp. But it never lasted, not really. The past always caught up, in dreams, in screams, in the glint of sunlight on a kitchen knife. And when someone in the village got sick, or a cow died unexpectedly, or a child ran off into the woods and didn't come back, people remembered the limping man who spoke to himself, who twitched when the wind changed, who stared too long into the fire. They pointed, they whispered, and sometimes they acted. More than a few veterans were accused of witchcraft. Cursed hands, tainted blood, even when they only ever bled for someone else's kingdom. Some were exiled, some stoned, some simply vanished, into the woods, into the wilderness, into madness. Their bodies never found. Only their warnings remained. Because in medieval Europe, healing didn't make you safe. Sometimes it just made you other, a creature born of war, shaped by steel, and rejected by peace. You were no longer a soldier. But you weren't quite a man anymore either. You had come back, but you had brought something with you, and no one knew how to live with that. So you became a story, a caution, a ghost that never died. The knife you see in the surgeon's hand, it's not new. It wasn't forged just for you. It's been used, over and over, on arms, legs, necks, torsos. It's sliced through meat, muscle, and sinew, and it's never once been properly cleaned. Welcome to the grim reality of recycled tools, the quiet horror of medieval surgery. Nothing in the surgeon's kit was sterilized. The concept didn't exist. They rinsed blades in water, wiped them on cloth, heated them only when they needed to cauterize, not to cleanse. The tools were passed from patient to patient, like cursed relics. Bone saws coated in flakes of old marrow. Hooks still rusting from the last rainy campaign. Awls, scissors, forceps. If they were dull, they were sharpened on stone. If they were dirty, they were wiped. That was it. And those tools weren't even exclusive. The same knife that cut your leg might have shaved a monk's beard last week. The same tongs that pulled an arrow from your rib might have been used to turn meat in the fire. Multi-use tools, multi-purpose disease vectors. They were never named, never numbered. No one kept inventory. No one tracked who they were used on. You didn't get your own set. You got whatever was nearby, still wet, still warm, still humming with someone else's pain. Blood soaked into wood handles, rust bloomed on metal edges, blades chipped from sawing through bone after bone. But they kept using them, because they had no choice. Each tool told a story, not of healing, but of volume, of how many limbs it had taken, how many screams it had witnessed. A good surgeon didn't replace his tools, he boasted about them. The older the saw, the more battles it had seen. A badge of honor, a mark of trust. Never mind the infections, never mind the dead. Some instruments were passed down through generations, father to son, barber to apprentice. Each nick, each stain, a memory. They were polished occasionally, if only to remove the chunks. But sterilized? Never. The blade you see before you now? It's probably cut through dozens before you, and it will cut through dozens after. In a world where metal was precious, and lives were cheap, the tools were sacred, and filthy, and deadly. You didn't just survive the wound, you survived the instruments. Because the saw didn't need to be sharp, just sharp enough. And the blood didn't need to be yours, it just needed to keep flowing. You've made it through battle, through wounds, blood loss, and infection. But now your mouth aches, not in a dull, ignorable way, but with sharp, stabbing, skull-splitting agony that makes everything worse. Eating? Impossible. Sleeping? Forget it. Even breathing makes the pain ripple through your jaw like fire. You think, surely there's help for this. Think again. Because medieval dentistry wasn't dentistry. It was torture with extra steps. There were no dentists on the battlefield, no specialists, no chairs with reclining backs or tools with graceful curves. Just whoever was nearby with strong arms, thick fingers, and a pair of pliers, or something close enough to do the job. You didn't get numbing. You didn't get clean tools. You got yanked, brutally, quickly if you were lucky, slowly if not. Tooth pain was often treated the same way everything else was, with fire, force, or prayer. An infected molar might be burned with a hot poker. A sharp stick might be jammed into the gum to release pressure. If the tooth was rotting, they'd try to chip it away with a hammer and chisel. No training, no restraint. Just the belief that whatever pain you were in, removal had to be worse. There was no understanding of cavities or nerves. Pain was thought to be caused by tooth worms, tiny creatures burrowing through your teeth. To get rid of them, they'd light herbs on fire and blow the smoke into your mouth. If that didn't help, they'd try cauterizing the gum. And if that didn't help, the tooth came out. Extractions were violent. You were held down. One man pulled your head back, another shoved iron into your mouth. The tooth didn't pop out clean. It cracked, it crumbled, gums tore, blood spilled fast and thick. Bits of enamel went flying. The socket stayed open, dirty, bleeding. Sometimes it got infected, sometimes it closed. Sometimes it bled until you passed out and didn't wake up. There were no replacements. No dentures. You lost a tooth, you lost it for good. And once one went, the others often followed. Jaw alignment failed. Chewing became a nightmare. You got weaker, sicker. A few teeth could be the difference between survival and starvation. But the worst part? No one cared. Because among the list of battlefield horrors, amputation, plague, death, your screaming mouth barely registered. You weren't dying fast enough, so you sat in silence, clutching your jaw, knowing that the only treatment left was someone with strong arms and no mercy. You hear them before you see them, high-pitched cries, shaky voices, small footsteps in oversized boots. They're children, barely old enough to lift a sword, let alone survive a battlefield. But they're here, because in the Middle Ages, war didn't wait for you to grow up, and medicine didn't care if your voice hadn't yet cracked. Some were soldiers, pressed into service as squires, messengers, or cannon fodder for when the real men ran low. Others were camp followers, orphans, sons of blacksmiths, boys looking for food or revenge or meaning. They carried buckets, water, tools, sometimes weapons, and sometimes they carried the wounded, tiny backs straining under blood-soaked limbs. They were injured just like the rest, struck by arrows, trampled by horses, cut down in the chaos. They bled the same, screamed the same, but when it came to care, they were last in line, if anyone bothered at all. Their smaller bodies didn't handle trauma well. A cut that might be survivable for a man could kill a child in hours. Blood loss hit harder. Bones shattered more easily. Fever burned brighter. And the treatments, already barbaric, were even more punishing. They were stitched without sedation, amputated without warning, cauterized without understanding. They didn't know what was happening. Most had never seen a surgeon's knife until it was already inside them. They cried for their mothers. They screamed for saints. They begged for pain to stop. And then they stopped screaming. Some survived, but survival didn't mean childhood. They left the tent smaller, sicker, and far older in the eyes. A boy missing a leg by age 9. A girl who watched her brothers die and never spoke again. They weren't seen as children anymore. They were seen as tools, or ghosts, or both. And when they died, they weren't buried with honors. Their graves were shallow, their names forgotten. No records, no ceremony. Just another small body tossed in with the rest, wrapped in a stained cloth that barely covered the bruises. This wasn't an era of innocence. It was an era of desperation. The battlefield didn't care how old you were, and neither did the medicine. Because in the end, the youngest victims weren't just collateral, they were casualties no one bothered to count. The battle is over. You're breathing, you're walking, you're even eating again. By medieval standards, that's a miracle. But there's a pain in your side, dull, pulsing, and growing sharper each day. Your leg wound has stopped bleeding, but it's beginning to smell wrong. And your shoulder? It's hot to the touch, the skin tight and red. Congratulations. What didn't kill you in battle is now preparing a second, slower strike. In the Middle Ages, delayed infections were the silent assassins. That arrow wound that seemed clean. It's now festering under the scab. That slice on your arm that stopped bleeding days ago? It's collecting pus like a plague bank. The real problem wasn't the injury itself. It was what came after. Because in a world without antibiotics, every wound was a gamble, and some took their time before playing their final hand. You start to cough. Not just a dry throat, but deep, rattling spasms that bring up streaks of red. Old air, someone calls it. Ghost breath. In truth, it's likely pneumonia or blood poisoning. But no one knows that. You're just told to rest. Maybe lie near the fire, drink some broth, pray. Meanwhile, your body begins its collapse. Your fever climbs. You sweat in waves. Your limbs twitch. Your belly bloats. The wound that healed last week now leaks yellow slime. Your joints ache. Your teeth hurt. You smell of rot. And everyone around you starts keeping their distance. The same people who toasted your survival now whisper and cross themselves when you enter the room. You don't sleep much anymore. When you do, you wake up soaked, shivering, choking on your own breath. The infection has moved inside you. You can feel it, in your bones, in your thoughts. You don't make sense when you talk. You see shadows in the firelight. You forget names. You forget time. And then, one morning, you can't get up. Someone wraps you in cloth. Someone mutters a prayer. They talk about how you were doing so well, how strong you looked, how brave you were. But they all knew. Everyone knew. What doesn't kill you waits. It waits in the dirt, in the blade, in the cloth, in the blood left on the knife that wasn't quite clean enough. You survived the battlefield, but the battlefield never left. It just sank deeper, into your flesh, into your lungs, into your future. And now, the only thing leaving is you. You've seen the worst. A man screaming as the saw chews through his thigh. A boy with half a face, gasping as flies swarm the other half. A soldier begging to die after being gutted but still breathing hours later. And sometimes someone listens. Sometimes someone makes it stop. Mercy killing. The term didn't exist, but the act did. In whispered corners of the battlefield, behind tent flaps, away from the eyes of priests and officers, men did what the surgeon wouldn't, what the gods, it seemed, refused. They ended the pain, quickly, quietly, with a hand over the mouth. a blade to the heart, a final twist of the neck. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't spoken of, but it happened. Because on the medieval battlefield, there were fates worse than death, and they happened every day. Some were mercy killings requested directly. "Please," a soldier would whisper, "end it." Others were silent understandings, a nod, a look, a groan too awful to bear. Sometimes it was a friend, sometimes a stranger, sometimes even a surgeon, his conscience drowning beneath the weight of screams. A quick stab, a cloth held too long, a drink laced with something strong enough to send the wounded man into permanent sleep. But mercy is complicated. What starts with compassion can end with convenience. Not all mercy killings were noble. Some were acts of panic, or impatience, or cruelty wrapped in the excuse of kindness. A man might be killed not because he asked, but because he was taking up space, or because the healer couldn't bear another failure. There was no law to protect it, no burial rites for it. The man who swung the knife was left to carry it in silence, or worse, to lie about it, to say the patient passed peacefully, to bury the truth with the body. And for those who lived, who witnessed it, the memory burned, not because it was wrong, but because it made sense. Because in that moment, death was not the enemy. It was relief, and that knowledge stayed. It never left. So yes, mercy killings happened, in blood, in whispers, in shadows. The cleanest cut on a battlefield was sometimes the one that ended it all, not with glory, not with prayers, just with mercy, brutal, quiet, final saw. You've tried everything. The bleeding won't stop. The fever won't break. The wound is spreading, blackening at the edges. You've had the prayers, the poultices, the hot iron. And yet here you are, still dying, desperate. So when someone comes to your cot with a new idea, a radical idea, you say yes. You don't ask what it is. You're past questions. You want relief, even if it's madness. In the Middle Ages, when standard torture didn't work, they moved to experimental cures. These weren't rooted in science. They were born from desperation, folklore, superstition, and the untested bravado of field medics who had run out of options. If it sounded like it might work, it was tried. On you. One cure involved burying the patient up to the neck in earth, because soil was believed to draw out disease. You'd lie there for hours, cold, filthy, surrounded by worms and your own shame. Others were doused in vinegar and lit on fire, not to burn, but to purify. Some were fed crushed beetles, dried toad powder, or the ashes of a dead man's bones. One method involved tying a live chicken to your wound, letting it absorb your illness through its feathers until the bird died. And yes, the chicken almost always died. But so did the patient. So no one really kept score. Some believed that disease came from bad smells, so they countered it with stronger ones. Your cot might be surrounded by burning hair, rotting onions, or bowls of hot tar. You inhaled it while coughing, already too weak to scream. In some monasteries, infected wounds were pierced with blessed nails. In battle camps, wounds were packed with dirt soaked in horse urine. Everything was worth a try. After all, the other guy died yesterday doing nothing. Even procedures like trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, were attempted not just for head trauma, but for persistent coughs or spiritual confusion. Bloodletting continued until patients passed out. Leeching was applied to the eyes. Incantations were mixed with herbal oils and smeared on the tongue. Not healing, just chaos in a robe. You weren't a person anymore. You were an experiment. a living corpse waiting to prove or disprove someone's guess. If you died, they tried something else on the next man. If you lived, well, that cure became a miracle. Never mind that it was your body, your will, your luck that did the heavy lifting. So yes, some were cured, but most were just tested, again and again, until there was nothing left to test. You've done the unthinkable. You've made it through the blood, the saws, the screams, the prayers, and the rot. Your wounds have closed. Your fever has faded. You can stand, maybe even walk. You're thinner, slower, scarred, but alive. And in a world where survival was a miracle, that made you something rare. A reason to celebrate. Celebration didn't come with parades or medals. This was the Middle Ages. No one threw you a feast, but people noticed. The healer who thought you'd never make it nods. The monk who gave you last rites avoids your eyes, maybe out of guilt, maybe awe. A priest might mutter something about divine intervention. You just know this. You were supposed to die, and you didn't. Sometimes survivors were paraded through the village, not in triumph, but as proof that God still listened. Other times, they were bathed, shaved, and blessed by candlelight. You were wrapped in clean cloth, given a loaf of bread, told to drink slowly and rest in the sun. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The scars told their own story. Deep gashes, missing limbs, burned patches, crooked bones. But they also gave you status. You were now a man who had faced death and spit in its eye. A lucky one, a chosen one, or, in darker corners, a cursed one who somehow escaped. Some survivors marked the day, not with joy, but with silence, sitting by a fire, holding a token from the battlefield, drinking alone, not because they were celebrating, but because they were remembering the ones who didn't make it, the ones who screamed beside them, the ones who bled faster. Healing wasn't instant. It took weeks, months, years. You walked with a cane. You breathed through one lung. You couldn't lift the way you used to. But people stopped you in the street, asked what it was like. You never knew how to answer. Sometimes the celebration came later, in the arms of someone who thought you were gone. In the moment you tasted something other than broth. In the first sunrise you watched without pain. You were changed. That was the truth. You didn't come back the same. No one ever did. But you came back. And in a world ruled by plagues, blades, and blind luck, that was worth everything. The trumpet has stopped. The moans are fading. And now, all that's left is silence, thick, heavy, permanent. You survived, or maybe you didn't. But someone has to deal with what's left behind. And it's not the night, not the priest, not the surgeon. It's the man with the shovel. In the world of medieval warfare, no one was more essential and more invisible than the grave digger. They arrived last and stayed longest. When the banners fell, and the nobles rode off, and the monks ran out of prayers, the grave diggers stepped in. Quiet, tired, covered in layers of old blood and older mud. They didn't fight for glory. They didn't heal for God. They cleaned. They buried. They scraped what was left of the living off the battlefield and made space for the dead. Grave digging wasn't a job. It was a sentence, often given to the poor, the desperate, or those paying off a crime. And it was dangerous, because battlefields didn't just stink of death, they breathed it. Disease rose from every corpse. Plague clung to every garment. Rats scurried across open wounds. cuts from bones, splinters from arrows. Even the wrong breath could mean infection and death. But the work had to be done. So they lifted the limbs, collected the teeth, stacked the broken swords, dug pits, threw in the bodies, sometimes dozens at a time. No names, no markers, just earth. Sometimes lime, sometimes nothing. And when the pits filled, they dug more. Behind the chapel, near the woods, under the hill. They became desensitized. They had to. You couldn't cry over every face, every boy with a snapped neck, every man clutching his stomach like he might still be holding it in. So they grunted. They cursed. They dug. They saw what war really left behind. And sometimes they stole. A ring here, a boot there, maybe a coin clenched in a dead hand. Can you blame them? No one paid them enough to lift body after body, day after day, in silence, while the survivors got praise and the lords got power. Grave diggers knew the truth. War wasn't glory. It was cleanup. It was rot. It was burial. When the banners were furled and the songs forgotten, it was their hands that held the weight of history, their dirt-covered palms that shaped what memory would forget. They didn't ask for thanks, and they rarely got it. But if anyone truly deserved a statue, it wasn't the man with the sword. It was the man with the shovel. So now you know you've marched through blood, watched limbs torn like parchment, heard men scream for their mothers with their lungs full of mud. You've smelled the pus, tasted the rot, dodged arrows only to meet fever. You've seen medicine that hurts more than heals, and survival that feels like punishment. You've watched the battlefield chew men up and spit them out as legends or corpses, sometimes both. Still dreaming of glory, because medieval war didn't hand out medals. It handed out trauma, infections, and a shortened spine. Honor wasn't in the sword swing. It was in enduring the infection that followed. Heroism wasn't in the banner. It was in the silence, when the survivors limped home, missing fingers and memories, unable to speak about what they'd seen. The poets will tell you about gallant charges. The painters will show you banners fluttering in perfect light. But they won't tell you about the bowel smell after death, or the boy coughing blood 2 days after the battle, or the blade that broke mid-swing and buried itself in a friend's back. Because the truth is ugly, glory is clean, and history prefers clean. But that's not what war gave. War gave you scars, lost sleep, screams in your dreams, and maybe, if you were lucky, a limp and a story you could never quite finish. Yet still, people marched. Still, they went. For duty, for gold, for country, for God. Or just because they had nothing else. That's the real story. Not knights or crowns, but desperation dressed in iron. So tonight, when you hear drums in your head, when you dream of banners and blade, ask yourself this: do you still want to be a hero? Because in the Middle Ages, the cost wasn't just your blood. It was your silence, your sleep, your soul. And those were the lucky ones.